The first time Daniel Mercer heard it, he thought it was the wind. He was standing on the cracked wooden porch of an old ranch house in the middle of nowhere, Montana, watching the sun bleed out across the horizon in long, tired streaks of orange and red. The air was cold, the kind of cold that settles into your bones before you even realize it is there. He had just driven 14 hours from Chicago, with nothing but 2 bags, a broken coffee machine, and the quiet decision that he was done with the life he had been living. But then he heard it again. Not the wind, something lower, something that moved through the tall grass at the edge of the tree line and disappeared before he could make sense of it. He told himself it was a deer. He told himself a lot of things that first night. He had no idea that what was watching him from the dark was not an animal at all, at least not entirely. He had spent the last 2 decades building a career in architecture in Chicago. Clean lines, glass buildings, award after award, a beautiful apartment on the 23rd floor, a marriage that lasted 7 years before it didn't, a son named Caleb, who was now 9 years old and lived with his mother in Portland, and who called Daniel every Sunday evening with a politeness that hurt more than anger ever could. There had been a fire, too, a project gone wrong, a building Daniel had designed that developed a structural flaw in its heating system. No one died, but 12 families had to be evacuated in the middle of January. The investigation cleared him of criminal negligence, but the professional damage was done. And more than the professional damage, there was the kind of internal damage that no investigation can address, the quiet, stubborn belief that you had failed the people counting on you. His therapist in Chicago had used words like burnout and grief. Daniel had nodded politely and stopped going after the 5th session. The ranch had belonged to his uncle, a man named Roy Mercer who died in February, leaving no wife, no children, and apparently no desire to update his will in the last 23 years, because Daniel, who had only met Roy 3 times in his entire life, inherited the property in full. 240 acres of mountain foothills, a weathered ranch house, an old barn that leaned slightly to the left, and more silence than Daniel had ever experienced in his adult life. He told himself he would stay for a month, fix the place up a little, clear his head, sell the property, and figure out what came next. He packed his car on a Tuesday morning while it was still dark outside and drove away without telling many people where he was going. The ranch was an 8-hour drive from the nearest city of any size. The nearest town, a small community called Greer Falls, was 22 miles down a 2-lane road that turned to gravel after the first 14. There was a general store, a gas station, a diner, and a post office. The woman at the general store, a stocky woman in her 60s named Margaret, gave him a long look when he mentioned Roy Mercer's ranch. "You're the nephew," she said. It was not a question. "I am," said Daniel. She packed his groceries slowly, the way people do in small towns when they are thinking about whether or not to say something. Finally, as she handed him the bags, she said, "You know Roy stopped going up to the north fence about 3 years ago." Daniel didn't know what that meant. He said so. Margaret pressed her lips together. "Just be careful out there at night," she said. "The wolves have been bold this year." He drove the rest of the way with the window cracked, listening to the sound of the world getting quieter with every mile. The first week at the ranch was hard in ways Daniel had not anticipated. He had expected the isolation. He had, in a strange way, even wanted it. What he had not expected was how loud silence can be when you are used to a city, how the absence of traffic and voices and the constant low hum of infrastructure fills up with other sounds, wind through pine trees, the creek at the east edge of the property, birds he couldn't name, and at night, from somewhere in the hills to the north, the long rising call of wolves. He slept badly the first few nights. He fixed small things around the house during the day, a broken window latch, a section of gutter that had come loose, a kitchen faucet that dripped. He built a fire every evening and sat in front of it with a book he never really read. He called Caleb on Sunday and listened to the son's careful 9-year-old voice describe a school project about oceans and felt the 1,000 miles between them like a physical weight in his chest. It was on the 9th day that he found the first sign. He had walked bare human feet, small, a child's size or close to it. He crouched down and studied them for a long time. They were not old. The edges were still sharp, the impressions deep enough to suggest they had been made within the last day or two. The human tracks and the wolf tracks moved in the same direction, side by side, before disappearing onto a stretch of rock where the ground left no impression at all. He stood up and looked at the tree line to the north. It was quiet. The pines stood still in the cold air, dark and close together. He told himself there was a reasonable explanation. A kid from a nearby property, maybe, someone hiking. He took a photograph of the tracks on his phone and walked back to the house. But he couldn't stop thinking about the way the two sets of tracks moved together, without any sign of the smaller feet trying to run or the larger ones trying to follow. They had been moving as a group. That night, the wolves were closer. He could hear them just beyond the north fence, a chorus of voices talking to each other in the dark, and beneath them, once, for just a moment, something that sounded almost like a voice responding. He sat up in bed for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling. He started going to the north fence every day. He told himself he was checking the condition of the wire and the posts. He brought tools. He did actually make repairs, but he always stayed longer than the repairs required, sitting on the top rail of a section he had reinforced, watching the tree line in the late afternoon light. On the 4th day of watching, he saw movement. It was brief, a shape at the edge of the trees, partly obscured by shadow. He couldn't tell at first whether it was an animal or something else. It was low to the ground, moving with a stillness that seemed less like stalking and more like absolute comfort with the earth beneath it. Then it rose, and for just a moment before the shadow swallowed it again, Daniel saw the pale line of a face. He did not move. He barely breathed. The shape watched him for what felt like a very long time. Then it was gone, back into the trees as silently as it had appeared. Daniel climbed down from the fence with hands that were slightly unsteady. He drove to Greer Falls the next morning and found Margaret at the general store. "There is someone living up in those northern hills," he said. He laid his phone on the counter and showed her the photograph of the tracks. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at Daniel, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite surprise. "You've seen her," she said. The words sat between them. "Her," Daniel repeated. Margaret came around the counter and pulled the door to the store closed, even though the parking lot outside was empty. She stood with her arms crossed and spoke in a low, careful voice, the way people speak about things they have carried for a long time. "Her name, as far as anyone here knows, is Lena. At least that's what Roy called her toward the end. He was the only one who ever got close enough to know that much." According to Margaret, Roy had discovered signs of someone living in the northern hills about 6 years ago. At first, he thought it was a squatter or a lost hiker, but the signs were permanent, and the figure he occasionally glimpsed was small, and it moved through the wilderness in a way that no casual hiker moved. Eventually, Roy stopped thinking of it as a person who had gotten lost in the wild and started understanding it as a person who belonged there. No one knew where she had come from. There were stories, most of them fragmented and uncomfortable to tell. A family that had attempted to homestead deep in those hills about 15 years ago, a couple with a very young daughter. The father had been troubled, Margaret used that word with a careful weight, and one winter the family simply stopped coming into town. People assumed they had left. No one investigated closely enough to know otherwise. What Roy believed, and what Margaret had come to half believe herself, was that the parents were gone, and that the little girl had not been alone in those hills. The wolves had been there, and somehow, in the way that stranger things have happened at the edges of the world, the child had survived. She'd be around 15 or 16 now, Margaret said. Roy used to leave food at the fence line, said she never took it while he watched, but it was always gone by morning.
Daniel drove back to the ranch in silence. He sat in the truck for a while after he parked, looking at the hills to the north. A girl, 15 or 16 years old, alone in those mountains, raised in some essential way by wolves. He started making a list. He did what Roy had done. He started leaving food at the fence line. He kept it simple: bread, a tin of sardines, an apple. He placed it carefully on a flat fence post in the early evening and walked away without looking back. In the morning it was always gone, but he could never be certain whether it was her or some other animal doing what animals do. He started sitting farther back from the fence when he worked on it, giving more space. He stopped trying to see her. He let himself simply be present in the landscape in an unhurried way, moving slowly, making no sudden gestures, speaking quietly to himself when he worked in the way he had heard his grandfather describe, handling skittish horses, not to communicate words, but to communicate tone. Calmness, consistency, the knowledge that he would be there tomorrow and the day after, and that his presence carried no threat. 3 weeks passed, then 4. On a morning in his 5th week at the ranch, he walked to the fence to leave the food and found that she had left something in return: a small flat stone with a circle scratched into it, placed precisely where he always set the tin. He picked it up carefully and held it in his palm for a long time. He placed it on the kitchen windowsill where he could see it when he made his morning coffee. 2 days.
Daniel stopped about 10 feet from the fence. He placed the food on the post slowly. Then he sat down on the ground, cross-legged, so that he was below her eye line. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "I'm Daniel," he finally said, quietly. "I live in Roy's house." Her eyes moved at the name Roy. Something shifted in her face. Not grief exactly, but a recognition of loss. "He's gone," Daniel said, even more quietly. "He passed away in February. I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was rough from disuse but unmistakably human, "He was kind." Those 3 words landed in Daniel's chest with a force he was not prepared for. "He was," Daniel agreed. She took the food from the post. She did not leave. They sat in silence as the sun came up over the hills, and somewhere in the pines behind her, Daniel could hear the wolves settling, their low murmurs moving through the trees like a conversation winding down. Over the following weeks, Lena came to the fence most mornings. She spoke in short sentences at first, then longer ones. Her English was uneven but present, full of gaps where words had never been learned, and occasional surprising precision where Roy, apparently, had talked to her through the fence for years and left books weighted down with rocks. She had taught herself to read from them, alone in the hills, by a logic that Daniel found quietly astonishing. He learned her story in pieces, the way you learn most things that matter, not all at once, but slowly, in the order that trust allows. Her parents had come to these mountains when she was very small, 3 or 4 years old. Her father had been running from something, though she did not use those words. He had been a man who believed the world was ending and that isolation was survival. The first winter was brutal. Her mother, who Lena remembers in fragments, a smell, a sound, a specific quality of gentleness, had not survived a fever when Lena was 5. After that, the details became harder. Her father became someone she described only as frightening, and then, eventually, absent. She did not say how he became absent. Daniel did not ask. Some silences are not doors asking to be opened. They are rooms a person has sealed off to stay sane, and the right thing to do with a sealed room is to acknowledge it is there and let it be. The wolves had found her during her 2nd winter alone, or perhaps she had found them. She was not entirely sure the direction of the finding. What she knew was that they had not harmed her, that a female wolf, large and gray, had allowed Lena to sleep near the pack on a night so cold that the trees were cracking, that the warmth of those animals had kept a small human child alive through a Montana winter that should have killed her. She had grown up among them, not as a wolf,
She was clear about this in her careful way, and there was a quiet dignity in how she corrected the assumption when Daniel came close to making it. She was not one of them. She was something that lived at the edge of their world and her own world simultaneously. They tolerated her. Occasionally, they seemed to seek her out. She understood their communication the way you understand the language of a place you have lived in for years without ever formally studying it, through patterns, through repetition, through the deep grammar of daily proximity. She survived because she was intelligent and because the wilderness, when you stop fighting it, teaches you what you need to know. But survival, Daniel came to understand, and living are not the same thing. It was a cold evening in October when everything shifted. Daniel had begun leaving the gate in the north fence unlocked. Lena had never used it. She always stayed on her side. But that evening she appeared at the fence line earlier than usual, and there was something different in her posture, a tension that did not belong to her usual stillness. "One of them is sick," she said, without preamble. The gray female, the one she called Old Mother in her own naming. Daniel could see now that he looked past Lena to the trees, the shape of a large wolf lying on its side at the edge of the pines, her breathing visible in the cold air, labored. "How long?" Daniel asked. 3 days. Daniel was not a veterinarian, he knew that, but he'd spent enough time researching the land and its wildlife in the past months to know what resources existed, and he made a call that evening to a wildlife biologist named Sarah O'Coffer, who worked out of the state university and who had, as it happened, been monitoring this particular wolf pack for the last 4 years. Dr. O'Coffer arrived the next morning. She was a calm, focused woman who asked very few unnecessary questions. When she saw Lena standing at the fence, she went very still for a moment, and then she simply nodded and said hello as though she encountered this situation regularly, which Daniel appreciated more than he could say. The wolf had an infected wound, likely from barbed wire. With antibiotics and care, she had a reasonable chance. Lena watched the entire procedure from inside the tree line, silent, her eyes tracking every movement Dr. O'Coffer made. Afterward, as Daniel walked the doctor back to her truck, she said quietly, "That girl has been on my radar for 2 years. I've seen signs of her near the pack. I thought she was a local kid going into the hills." She paused. "She needs more than a fence and food left on a post, Daniel." "I know," he said. "She needs documentation. She needs medical care. She needs—" Dr. O'Coffer stopped herself. "She needs someone to figure out who she is." Daniel looked back at the fence. Lena was gone, back into the pines. "She knows that," he said. "She's just deciding whether it's worth the risk." That night he sat by the fire for a long time. He thought about Caleb in Portland, being raised in a house where everything was careful and organized and safe, and still somehow missing something. He thought about the girl in the hills who had nothing that the world called safe, and still, against every probability, become someone remarkable. He thought about the word belonging and what it actually means, which is not the same as the word safety, though people confuse them constantly. The morning after the wolf's treatment, Lena came to the gate. She stood at it for a long time without touching it. Daniel was on his porch, far enough away to not feel like pressure, present enough to be there if she needed him. He drank his coffee and waited. She opened the gate herself. She walked across the frost-covered grass towards the house slowly, stopping twice to simply stand and take in what she was seeing. Daniel did not go towards her. He went inside and put another cup of coffee on the table, then came back out and sat on the porch steps. She came and sat beside him, not touching, with a distance that felt exactly right. "Roy told me," she said, "that there was a world out there that was worth going back to." She paused. "I didn't believe him." "And now?" Daniel asked. She was quiet for a while. "I don't know if I believe it now either, but I think I am tired of not finding out." Daniel nodded. There was nothing to say that would improve on that, so he said nothing. They sat on the porch as the morning came in over the hills. Behind the north fence, somewhere in the dark pines, a wolf called once, a long, clear note that rose and then tapered into silence. Lena tilted her head and listened to it with an expression Daniel had no name for. Not sadness, not longing exactly, but something in the territory between them, the particular ache of a heart that is large enough to belong to more than one world. Over the following weeks, what followed was slow and complicated and real. Dr. O'Coffer connected them with a social worker named James Hadley, a patient and experienced man who had worked with children in unusual situations before and who understood that the conventional machinery of child services would need to be applied with significant care. There were legal processes, inquiries, the careful reconstruction of Lena's identity from the fragments available, a birth certificate found eventually in a county records search, a name confirmed, Elena Marsh, born in Billings, 16 years old. There were difficult days. There were days when Lena retreated back to the north fence and sat on her side of it, and Daniel respected that completely, bringing food and sitting at a distance and asking nothing. There were days when the human world felt like an enclosure rather than an opening, and Daniel understood that feeling more than he had ever expected to. He called Caleb one Sunday and found himself telling his son about Lena in a careful way, watching his words, and his son said quietly, "Is she okay, Dad?" with a seriousness that made Daniel realize, not for the first time, how much he had underestimated his child. There were also good days. Days when Lena sat in the kitchen and watched Daniel cook and asked careful questions about everything, how the stove worked, what each spice was, why people ate at a table